Getting my readers on.
You're all set now.
Yeah. Depends on the day on whether or not I can read. So
Today's a
most days,
non-reading day, huh?
so far not. No. Like I was reading earlier and I needed these to kind of pay attention to what I was seeing.
So is it weather dependent or like just
I think
sleep
it might,
dependent or
I
just
think
random?
I think it's weather. I think it's how much sleep I got. I think it's allergies. I'm not sure,
Hmm.
but some days are better than others. Anyway, welcome everybody. Good to see you.
Hey, that's good.
Um,
You can see.
yeah, that's right. We're going to be in Romans chapter 1, and I think our goal is to talk about like maybe the first 17 verses together. Um, we appreciate the enthusiasm of those of you that have started to follow along. We kind of did some overview stuff last week or last time with why Paul's writing this letter, what some of the things he pointed out at the end were the themes of the letter. I think a lot of that's going to come back up here in the introduction, but do you have anything you wanted to say before I read our section?
No, let's get in it.
All right. Romans 1, verse 1. Paul, a bondservant of Christ Jesus, called as an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, concerning his Son, who was born of a descendant of David according to the flesh, who was declared the Son of God with power by the resurrection from the dead, according to the Spirit of holiness, Jesus Christ our Lord, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles for his name's sake, among whom you also are the called of Jesus Christ. To all who are beloved of God in Rome, called as saints, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, because your faith is being proclaimed throughout the whole world. For God, whom I serve in my spirit in the preaching of the gospel of his Son, is my witness as to how unceasingly I make mention of you, always in my prayers making request, if perhaps now at last, by the will of God, I may succeed in coming to you. For I long to see you, so that I may impart some spiritual gift to you, that you may be established, that is, that I may be encouraged together with you while among you, each of us by the other's faith, both yours and mine. I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that I often have planned to come to you and have been prevented so far, so that I may obtain some fruit among you also, even as among the rest of the Gentiles. I am under obligation both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. So, for my part, I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, but the righteous man shall live by faith.
Amen. I think this is a cool, we kind of talked last time about how, you know, for whatever reasons, people put the books of the Bible in the order that they're in. It is kind of
Mhm.
nice to have Romans where it is, following with the book of Acts and kind of leading the way in the writings of Paul. I guess there's two things to me in this opening section, just kind of big picture that I notice. One is probably kind of obvious, and that is that this is a really good sort of definition and summation of the gospel. That's the lead off in verse one. He
Mhm.
mentions, I mean, the word gospel comes up, I want to say four times maybe, verse 1, verse 9, verse 15, and verse 16. I may have missed one, but that's kind of this whole section is it's talking about the gospel, the work of the gospel, and all that kind of thing. But the other thing to me is that this is actually a really good, if you had to just clip out one section out of all of Paul's writings as sort of a bio, I think there's probably slightly better ones like Philippians 3 or a couple other places like that. But this is, I mean, Paul talks about himself a lot. Like the word I is all
Yeah.
throughout this passage, especially starting in verse 8. It's like almost every line. I'm thankful
Yeah.
for this, and I want to do this, and I feel I'm under obligation like this, and I'm not ashamed like that. So it's a lot about Paul and Paul's relationship to the gospel, which it seems like a lot of the letter um, is kind of Paul addressing maybe criticisms people had of him or assumptions people had of him and his relationship to his Jewish brethren, all that kind of thing. So I like that because it really sets the tone for the remainder of the letter, where Paul's going to be helping us understand the nature of the gospel. And it's coming from a really personal place on his part, as he's explaining what he really means when he's preaching the gospel and why it's so important to him. So I like that in this opening section.
Yeah. No, I agree. And knowing that Paul's never been here, Paul's not been to this place, he's expressing that he wants to come to that place. But also knowing the controversy about Paul that existed in the first century and all the things that the Romans would have heard about Paul, throughout the years, and with him kind of getting things primed for him to go to Rome eventually. It makes sense that he wants to introduce himself, that he
Mm.
wants to. I mean, the first section is, hey, look, here's what I think about Jesus, and here's why I think what I think about Jesus. He was declared the Son of God. Here's who he is. He's born a descendant of David, but he spends time like, here's what I believe about, you know, our Savior. We share this. And then, like you said, here's who I am, and here's what I intend, and here's what I want. It's funny. I have in my Bible all those I statements from Paul. I thank my God. I serve in my spirit. I make mention. I long to see you. I may be encouraged. Like that, those stand out to me too. You know, these are all the things that Paul wants. And I think by way of application, it's good for us to maybe highlight those and say, is this how I talk? Is this how I think? You know, can I say along with Paul that I'm grateful to God because of people I've never met who serve God? Can I say with Paul, that this is how I serve God in my spirit? I love that phrase, you know, not just with some activities, not just with my body, but like deep down within me, like all of me. This is how I see it. Anyway, I love all of that. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not, I think kind of the way that I frame up this section is verses 1 through 7. What
mm,
is the gospel? I mean, we'll get to that in a second, but it's actually a great just definition. It's funny because I think for the longest time, I would look at verse 16 for kind of a definition of the gospel. And I think it's fair to do that to some extent. But really, verses 1 through 7 are a lot better breakdown of just what is the gospel. Here it is, boom, boom, boom. He goes through it. And then verses 8 through 15 are uh, how the gospel has shaped me. All those things that you were talking about. It's made me grateful. It's made me a giver, right? Like, why do you want to come to Rome so bad, Paul? Well, I want to
mm,
go to impart some spiritual gift that I could encourage the brethren there. They could encourage me. The gospel has shaped me into a giver and somebody who wants to go to help others. We'll learn at the end of the book. Actually, not only do I want to give something to Rome, I want to go past Rome to uncharted territories at this point. So 1 through 7, what is the gospel? 8 through 15, how has the gospel shaped me? And then verses 16 through 17, why is the gospel such a big deal? Because I mean, he kind of gives some facts about the gospel in 1 through 7, and then he describes the change that it's made in his life or the character that it's shaped. But 16 and 17 is really where he really says, this is why the gospel is able to do this and why it's changed everything about me. This is what I think about that thing that I told you about in sort of bullet list form in verses 1 through 7. This is why it's
mm,
such a big deal. And it actually has changed everything about me and the way I live my life and the way I relate to other people and all that kind of stuff. And I know that's kind of obvious for all of us, but it is easy to kind of forget that the thing that's supposed to shape us is the gospel. It's not just the church that I go to or how my family raised me or the culture that I live in that may or may not be a Christian culture or whatever. It's this essence of who Jesus is and what he did. That's got to change everything about how I live and how I relate to people, how I think about myself and how I move around in the world. That's got to be the thing that really shapes me into somebody different.
yeah. And to what you're saying, I think a lot of us grow up knowing that the gospel is supposed to shape us, the gospel is supposed to change us, that we're supposed to look a certain way because of it. And we talk a lot like that. but it really changes when you meet somebody who it's actually happened to
Mhm.
and they're able to articulate it, you know. I think that was always one of the things that was valuable about Paul is the good news in his life had changed him so dramatically. And he would say things like this in his writings. You know, God used him as a demonstration of what could be done in somebody's life. So
Mhm.
for Paul to be able to lay it out and then actually meet these people eventually, you know, like to actually meet them, or when you see Paul like in some of the places where he goes and the people get to know him, how moved they are by him, how when he goes to leave they hug on him and cry and they don't want him
Yep.
to leave, how he could literally say things like imitate me as I imitate Christ. And but here is a good section to maybe see that in some ways. So that I like the way you frame that up.
Yeah,
You
it'd
know,
be a fun
it kind
exercise
of,
to do verses 8 through 15, but rewrite each one of those statements, those I statements, for Saul of Tarsus before he
oh
believed in
yeah.
the gospel. You know what I mean? First, I pray imprecatory prayers to my God because of your faith in that heretic Jesus of Nazareth, or
Right.
for God, whom I serve in my flesh, in the keeping, all this kind of, in my circumcision of my flesh or whatever. Like there's all these things, but here it's all things are totally different for him because of the gospel. And I guess I say that to say, I'm thinking about for myself, can I write out similar statements? Or would some of these statements not be able to be true about me? Am I still in like a pre-gospel spiritual formation that hasn't been touched yet by the gospel? And I think that's a good way to kind of examine ourselves is like, would I sound more like Saul of Tarsus or would I sound more like Paul the apostle who believes in the gospel of God?
Yeah, that's good. And honestly, like if you saying to do that exercise, like changing his statements for Saul of Tarsus, or when he, before he was became a Christian, wouldn't he writing? He'd probably be writing to synagogues of Jewish
Mhm.
people, and saying like, "Look, I thank God that you guys are holding fast to this, and you're not being carried away by this false teaching about this
Yeah.
guy, this blasphemer." You know, I serve God with my spirit by preaching and teaching the law.
Mhm.
Like what had changed for Paul was his tribe
Yeah.
and who he both wanted to encourage and strengthen, and who was going to encourage and strengthen him. And then the shocking thing he's going to say in this section is, I'm trying to bring barbarians and Gentiles and foolish people that once Paul would have looked at with disdain. I'm trying to bring them into the tribe and make them like us in Jesus Christ, which is going to be the theme of this book, right?
Yep.
I was going to point out, like when he starts in verse 1, he identifies himself a certain way, like bondservant, called as an apostle, set apart for the gospel. Like these are his ways of describing himself. And then in verse 7, when he writes to them, he says, "To all of you who are beloved of God in Rome, you're also called." Just like he says, "I'm called as an apostle." You guys are called as saints. And there's just like he said, called as an apostle, set apart. You guys are called as set apart people as well. Like there's not a lot different between us, is kind of how I read that introduction. And then his graciousness to say in the next section in verses 8 through 17, look, I'm not coming there thinking I'm just going to give you something. Like I really do believe you guys can strengthen me. You can encourage me. I, I'm curious about this as a real question for you, Ben. Do you sometimes, you know, have a hard time convincing some people like where you are in Africa, or even just like when you were evangelistic in all the places you've lived? Somebody you're kind of helping, teaching, strengthening them in the Lord, helping them understand the scriptures. When you say something to them like, look, you're a huge encouragement to me. Like you really make my life better. Is it hard sometimes to really convince them of that? Like they don't like I have I don't know if you know what I mean, but like people are like, no way. Like I don't do anything for you. And you're like, no, you really do. Like, and they really did for Paul. Like, I don't know.
I literally had like two conversations yesterday. A friend of mine and I were talking, and he was just kind of commenting on just from the States. We were on the phone, and my buddy Blake, and he was kind of commenting like, man, like you kind of sound like different, like better, like just more whole, whatever. And I was like, yeah, like I think that's probably true. Like I didn't know that until enough people have said that to me over the past few months, and all that's good and fine. And that's just new experiences, different things, whatever. And, that's life. May also be that we sleep more as our kids are getting older. That is a very likely big piece of it. But but anyway, but I was, and I mean this would be the same thing I would say to friends in Brooklyn, in Atlanta, Birmingham, every place I've lived. But I was literally telling some guys today, I was like, hey, like, we were meeting together and praying together today. And I just told a couple of the guys, I was like, y'all really have been life changing to me, just getting to know you and getting to know your stories and what you're doing. And they were looking at me like, you know,
Like you're just saying something.
and kind of even just like confused. Like that doesn't make any sense, dude. But whatever.
Right.
Like maybe we don't understand you because of your accent right now, because that doesn't make any sense that you could be saying that. But it's true. I mean, it's not something that it's not something I'm just saying just to say it to make people feel good. Like you mean it. But I do think people struggle with believing that sometimes.
Yeah, I think this is actually super important to get a hold of because I will say, like, I think when I was first beginning to teach and preach, I thought, I thought a lot like, I'm going to help people. I'm going to do these things for people. And I think there's sometimes people, whether they're preachers or whether they're just people trying to be evangelistic and share the gospel, that just think in terms of I'm the teacher. I'm the teacher. And until you start realizing, no, like you're participating in something that God designed, where you use your gift to strengthen people, they use their gift to strengthen you. That
Mhm.
there's iron sharpening iron in this, that we aren't above, you know, the the health that comes from other people's provision in this exchange. Until that happens, you're gonna struggle, I think. I mean, even Jesus himself, when he would say something like with the woman at the well, when he tells his disciples, I have food that you don't know about, like I have food to eat that you don't know about. He's literally talking about like a conversation that he's having with a woman at a well. And something fuels him about this, you know, because he was getting something from it. Like it was healthy for him and helpful for him to be strengthened by other people. I just think that's a really important attitude that we learn in this text.
Yeah. I can never read this first chapter without kind of casting forward to chapters 15 and 16 because you can almost kind of fold this letter up in a little like full circle thing. And you see that big time in chapter 16, where, it's easy to read through chapters and be like, okay, cool. Paul's saying hey to a bunch of people. But you really carefully read that list, and we'll get there, someday in the future, I guess. But there's some people who meant a lot to him. I mean, he talks about, what is it, the mother of Rufus, who is my mother also. Like there's a
Hmm.
vulnerability with somebody being a mom to you. And I mean, I could
Yeah.
list off a bunch of people that fit that bill. I'd feel bad to forget some names if I started saying them, but sisters and brothers and moms and all this kind of stuff. And Paul is saying like, I need you guys, in other words. And I think
Right.
Paul, even in other parts of this letter, even when he's sort of, doing his doctrinal teaching, he's pretty vulnerable and exposes himself in terms of just his feelings about things. I think is it chapter 9 where he talks about like, I'm just dying for my Jewish brethren to get this thing. I would be cursed myself for them. Well, he's kind of laying himself bare there and reflecting, which I think is just the attitude that enables you to have this kind of mentality toward brethren, where you don't think you're above people or you're separate from people, but actually you're humbled and you're like, hey, like I'm not me being above anybody else. That's not even in the discussion here, which I think comes back to like, why would you even feel that way? Why would you think that way, Paul? Why would you be open to other people like that? People who probably Rufus's mom, or I maybe getting mixed up what the guy's mom was, but she may be like, what? Like, that doesn't even make sense. You could talk like that, Paul. But he's saying, like, I'm like a kid and I need this lady to be my mom. And I have to believe a lot of the reason is back to this opening section because of what he understood about the gospel. And it
Yeah.
really reshaped his whole conception of himself and the way he would relate to brethren and even outsiders because he knew he wasn't the big shot anymore. The big shot is Jesus Christ, and he's the only one. And all of us are being changed by him in the same way.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. There's a proverb, and I probably should have it memorized exactly where it is, but one of the proverbs says, "A hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a desire fulfilled is a tree of life."
Mm.
I think, one of the things I read in this section is Paul keeps saying how much he wanted to be there. Like, I mean, in verse 10, always in my prayers making request. And just listen to this language. If perhaps now at last, by the will of God, I may succeed in coming to you. Like,
Yeah.
how long has he thought about this? How long has he wanted to be there? How long has he wanted to like do something like this? He does it again when he gets to, is it verse 14? Um,
I mean, the very next verse, he says, I
oh,
long to see you. Verse
yeah,
11.
I long to see. Oh, verse 13. I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that how often I plan to come to you, and I've been prevented so far. Like you can hear this, like this ache, and you kind of wonder, like, leading up to writing this letter, and even however long it's going to take him after writing this letter to finally get there and sit in prison in Jerusalem and Caesarea, and like all the places that he had to go first. Just by way of encouragement, how many of us want to serve God in certain ways?
Mm.
And how many of us have thought, like, I want to do more than I've done? And that's what Paul's expressing. I want to obtain fruit among you. I'm under obligation to Greeks and barbarians. I want to come to you on my way somewhere else. Like I've got all these plans, all these hopes, all these things. Now, I don't think that ever like kept Paul from doing what he needed to do in the moment, serving where he should serve.
Hmm.
But I read an ache here in him, just in his language. And all of us maybe have felt that at times, like, I
Yeah.
want to do more for the Lord. When's that day going to come? You know?
And probably in a lot of different arenas. I mean, it's easy to relate this with Paul as a preacher, but I don't know, people in terms of their family relationships, what they'd love to see happen in their
Yeah.
family, or even to have a family, of their own, or, I mean, go down the list of a bunch of stuff like that that people really wish for, that sometimes can take a lot longer than, like you said, long enough to make you sick.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't remember what time we started. Were you paying attention?
Not really.
No, me
We
either.
probably should talk about verses 1 through 7 and then verses 16 through 17 at some point.
Oh, well, I thought we were just going back and forth.
Yeah,
Is there
yeah.
anything else you want to add about the greeting or salutation?
No, no, I think it's great. I love the stuff you said. I think it's good.
Hmm. Well, focusing on, when he turns his attention, Paul does this a lot in Romans, where it sounds like he starts to make a list, but then he never like finishes the list. Like in verse 8, my version says like first, I thank my God. And then I'm looking for the second. Where's the second thing, like that Paul's gonna say? We'll talk about that later in the book when he starts like listing things about the benefits of being a Jew, and he waits like chapters before he ever finishes the list.
Yeah. I was trying to remember if there's a finally, he'll do finally sometimes. That'd be great if he just went first and then jumped straight to finally,
Yeah.
skipped everything
A
else in
lot of,
between.
yeah. Just like us preachers sometimes say finally right in the middle of our sermon, but we're only
Yeah.
halfway done.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, anything you want to talk about that stands out? We've already talked about some of these statements that he makes.
Um, where are you talking about? In 8 through 15?
And yeah, like 8 through 17 or so, 8 through 15.
No, not really. I think we've hit most of it. Well, I guess one other thing, I mean, we've touched, you kind of touched on it a few minutes ago, which is probably good to underline it because it's going to be such a huge theme throughout this book. And even here in the beginning, this emphasis on looking to all the nations and all peoples,
Yeah.
right? It's in verse 15, right? I want to come to obtain some fruit among you, just as among the rest of the nations. He kind of brought this up in verse 5, where he talks about, hey, my apostleship was given so that I would bring the obedience of faith among all the nations. And then, of course, like the most famous verse of the book, I guess, verse 16, that the gospel is the power of God for salvation, everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And I think he mentioned the
Mhm.
Greeks in verse 14. So, I mean, he's right off the bat, which kind of makes sense just because of the type of place that Rome was, but it's also really relevant for, I mean, Paul's own ministry as being the apostle to the Gentiles, but really, I mean, Great Commission,
Yeah.
Acts chapter 1. I mean, all the passages are really big on this. And of course, the prophets were really big on it, which he highlights here at the beginning. And that's going to be a big kind of tension point that um, that he feels like he needs to sort of give a defense or an argument for throughout this book, is how this gospel really is for all the nations, which shows that it needs to be a priority for us. When we think about the gospel, it's not just for us, it's not just for our church, it's for all people everywhere, and trying to think about how we can participate in what God's doing to bring the gospel to all nations. That seems to be kind of the upshot of why he was longing to come to Rome, why he was just so desperate to get there. It was because he was mindful of, how can I help out the Christians in Rome, be helped by the Christians in Rome, so that we can keep this thing cooking for all the nations.
And I wonder too, when he says something like that in verse 14, I'm under obligation, both to Greeks, to barbarians, wise and foolish. If somebody was like, do you know who you're talking about? Like, do you
Hmm.
understand what they're like?
Yeah,
You've never been here to Rome, Paul. Do you know what goes on right behind me in the White House? Like, do you really know who these people are? Because I mean, you're sort of this sheltered Jewish guy that grew up homeschooled, like with, Gamaliel, and you've
yeah,
never seen this kind of debauchery. You've never seen this kind of disgusting stuff. In fact, most of us here in Rome that are righteous people, I mean, we can't barely stand any of the Greeks and the barbarians and the foolish and the ungodly. We can't. Do you know what you're talking about? Which is why when he gets to verse 18, and in verse 18 through the rest of the chapter, he lays out exactly who he exactly knows who he's talking about.
hmm,
And he knows why the gospel's so important, because the wrath of God being revealed among these people for the ways they've turned their back on God and stopped being thankful, and he's given them over to these things. Paul legitimately believes the gospel can bring them back. He really believes that Jesus Christ can change the trajectory of what he's about to lay out. Is he knows who he's talking about, you know? I think that's really important, because I know for some of us, when we first start thinking like, yeah, I want to share the gospel with people, we kind of mean like, I want to share the gospel with people who are already pretty good, already know some stuff. Maybe we'll debate some doctrinal stuff. But when I'm like, I really want to take the gospel to the lost, it's like, do you know what you're talking about? Like, do you know how lost the lost are? Like, do you know how ugly this can get and how dark this can be? And and Paul's just in this chapter being like, I know exactly what I'm talking about, you know? So,
and I mean, he kind of hints at that with verse 5, which I think is a pretty important verse. I mean, okay, why are you an apostle, Paul? What's your whole thing about? Well, I want to bring the obedience of faith
mm,
among all the Gentiles in behalf of his
mhm.
name. Well, okay, so what he's kind of implying, which as you said, he's going to get into, like, yeah, I know exactly the kind of ick that I'm going to have to get involved in whenever I'm in Rome and anywhere else among the nations. Um, that's kind of my whole deal. And I want to bring them to obedience of faith, which means I'm very well aware that they are not obedient. They are not loyal to God. They're loyal to all other kinds of, well, not even really, they're loyal to themselves and all these other
Right,
gods that they serve.
right.
And they're not living in an obedient way. And that means there's all kinds of nasty stuff that's going to come up. But that's kind of my whole thing, is I want to help people to learn what it would mean to be loyal to Jesus Christ and to live in an obedient manner to him. I was saying one thing about verse 5 is kind of bigger picture just about Romans. I think it's really helpful. Sometimes talking about faith in the book of Romans can get a little tricky because people have all these definitions of what faith is and what it's not. And there's a lot of, I think, perversions that have kind of cropped up about that. But it's nice that the first time in Romans and the last time in Romans that the word faith is used, it's in this phrase, the obedience of
Mhm.
faith. 1:5, and I think it's 16:26 or something like 16:25.
Right.
But I think that's nice because it kind of tells you, okay, everything else in between, whenever he's talking about faith, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about the kind of loyalty that honestly people in Rome would have to Caesar. Later he's going to talk about someone who will confess with the mouth that Jesus is Lord, basically. Well, the confession of a Roman citizen was Caesar is Lord. He's my king. He's my master. And I'm loyal to him. I will not betray him, and I'll do whatever he wants me to do. Paul says, hey, the gospel, which was promised beforehand by the scriptures, is about a king. Verse 3.
Mhm.
It's not first about salvation. It is the power of salvation, but first, it's that Jesus is the Son of God. Psalm 2, the king who rules over all the nations, all of them, even the barbarians, even the Greeks. They don't know it, they don't recognize it, but he's their king. And he was born a descendant of David according to the flesh and was declared the Son of God with power through the resurrection. And so, just as much as all these Roman citizens, these Greeks and barbarians and everybody else would say, Caesar is Lord and I'm obedient to him, and that's why they're doing all the crazy, horrifying stuff they're doing,
Mhm.
I'm out here saying Jesus is Lord. He's the Son of God. He's the King. He's the ruler of all rulers and of all the nations. And our job is to get people on board with that and to let people know about that kingly authority and rule and sovereignty of Jesus, the true and better Caesar, so that all these people who are doing this nasty stuff can start living in a loyal, obedient way to Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that's great. That's really good. I hadn't thought about that phrase on both ends of the book. That's good. We probably need to wind this down time wise, but I'm struck in verse 14 just that he uses the language of debtor or obligation.
Hmm.
And then he doesn't say, like, I'm a debtor to Jesus Christ, or I'm a debtor to, the Christians who I used to persecute. Like, it's an interesting phrase to me that he's like, I'm under obligation to Greeks and to barbarians, to the wise and to the foolish. I think the implication is what Jesus has done for me. I didn't earn it. I didn't pay for it. He's going to call it a free gift later.
Hmm.
But man, if it doesn't put a sense of like obligation or debt or like that I got to feel a burden here. I know a long time ago I did a sermon where I just took that word or the family of that Greek word through Romans, and there's a bunch of times he's going to use this concept of being a debtor or being obligated. Owe no man anything except to love one another. And there's more than those kind of things. Like we may highlight that as we get to it, but Paul felt a debt because of the gospel that was not just projected at the one who saved him, but on the ones that Jesus wanted to save. And he felt the burden of that. And I think that's important.
That's awesome. And I wonder if that's why some of that stuff is probably related to in verse 16 where he says, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel.
Hmm.
There might be a shame for a Jewish guy, and I think there's probably a lot in that statement of why he would not be ashamed, including, um, yeah, a
We
lot of
should
stuff. But
start
anyway,
we should start our next one on that. And like we need
yeah,
to
that's
probably
true. That's true.
deal with
That's true.
verses
So
16 and
we won't
17
dive
next.
into too
But
deeply. We won't try to do all 16 and 17. But I guess my point, just to your point about the barbarians, there would be a lot of shame
yeah.
for maybe the average Jewish, respectable, godly, Torah knowing and Torah keeping, circumcised dude who grew up in the Fide Gamaliel. It's like, man, why are you hanging out with all these barbarians? This is disgusting. And
Hmm.
all these Greeks, there's like pork everywhere, man. This is crazy. What are you doing? And he's kind of saying, hey, I'm not ashamed of the gospel because I know what it's done for me and I know what it can do for everybody else. It's not even that I'm just tolerating these people. I feel like the good kind of love, grace
Yeah.
driven burden that I really care
Yeah.
for these people, which is you were kind of pointing out earlier. If I don't have that kind of spirit toward other people,
Yeah.
especially people that because of my socioeconomic class or my race or my nationality or my political
Knowledge.
views or my spiritual background or whatever, if I can't learn to embrace and feel sort of like not the bad kind of burden, but the good kind of burden, like I need to be with these people and I need to try to do what I can to help and be helped and all that stuff, then we probably have missed a little bit of the gospel if we haven't been transformed in that kind of mentality toward others.
Yeah. Very good. All right. Let's put our pin down there.
Sounds good. This was fun.
Thanks everybody for sticking with us. We appreciate it.
Yep, no doubt. We'll see y'all next time. Thank you.